Welcome back. This is part 5 of the videos concerning congregational vitality, and we're working through the workbook. Hopefully you've just had a conversation about technical and adaptive change and the kinds of change your congregation is facing now and the kinds of change you've faced in the past. Here's what I'm wondering. I want to talk mostly about the whole idea of adaptive change because most of us know how to do technical change. But I want to talk to you in terms of what's really happening in your congregation. Here's the thing. Most of us think the whole point of change is to keep our Jenga tower strong and steady. So let's work on having that clear sense of mission and having strong leadership and good relationships, and you should do all those things. But here's my wondering. What if God isn't interested in your tower or being a tower anymore? What if God is trying to build something new and different with your congregation? What if sometimes it's good to knock over the tower so that we can build something new and different? And what if in that new building we want to add blocks that weren't in the original tower? Maybe some of those blocks come from the neighbors around you. Maybe they come from other congregations nearby. Who knows? But the point is, it's not just about having individual towers of congregations. Sometimes you need to open your mind to what God's trying to do in the neighborhood. And that's when we call it adaptive change, right? So technical change is strengthening the tower we've always had. Adaptive change is adapting to a whole new shape and way of being. And the question becomes, well, how do we go about doing that? Well, the first step in doing that is opening up your mind to maybe what God's doing and not just trying to choose the next direction, because you're never going to be able to choose the new shape because you don't know what the shape's going to be. It could be this thing on the left. It could be the one on the right? It could be something entirely different. So it's a process of opening up your mind to where God's going. And that process is actually pretty well known and described in a lot of different adaptive change books. I'm just going to highlight it here, but I encourage you to do further reading, and there are some resources on the Congregational Vitality website. The first step to it is going to be discernment. That just means listening to God. You can do that through Bible studies, and you can do it through practices like dwelling in the Word, where as a group you read it and you reflect on it and you ask each other questions about it and you share those things. And it's through those conversations that God actually speaks right there in real time, speaks to your heart, speaks to the group, and lends some direction. You have to expect God to show up and do stuff here, because that's what discernment's about. The other piece of that early start is this other listening. These are sometimes called the 3 great listenings. So it's listening to God, it's listening to one another. Even if you think that you are a family and you all know each other, that may be true, but it's important to have intentional conversations about this process, about what is God doing here now? Where is God calling us to be? What new shapes might we be in? What are our hopes? What are our fears? What's our loss? What's our grief? It's got to be processing all these things together intentionally and not just assuming that you know what's going on with other people. So inviting you into a time of intentional listening with one another. Sometimes that's done through one-to-one caring conversations. Sometimes it's done through small group kind of conversations around tables, maybe in people's homes. There's different ways to do that. And again, there's resources on the Vitality website. Finally, you need to be listening to the people in your neighborhood. How are you going to know what other blocks you're supposed to include if you haven't met these folks and you don't have a relationship with them? Point of these meetings isn't to invite them to church per se, although you shouldn't deny them. It's more about developing a relationship with them at all. So if you're not familiar with who the neighbors are, you can go around and introduce yourself as a neighbor. Ask what their concerns are, share what some of yours are about the neighborhood, not just yourself. And again, there's many books and resources on how to do that. But that is the first stage to adaptive change, is noticing what's going on with God, within your congregation's people, and with the neighborhood. After you've noticed that, you need to then reflect on what you heard. It doesn't do any good to do all these listenings and then not think about what was learned. That reflection is almost, well, it's certainly as important, maybe even more important in some ways than just listening. So who's going to do the reflecting, and how are you going to process what you've heard? And then from those reflections, you will probably come up with some ideas, some things you want to try, things you haven't done, things that never occurred to you before. That's when we call it an experiment, and it's totally an experiment. It might fail, it might succeed. Actually, first time around, it might it's more likely to fail in some ways, right? Because the kind of experiments that will occur to us are going to come from our old imagination of what it means to be church. That's okay. Do an experiment, and then again, take time to reflect on that, because it's in the time you take to reflect that you're going to actually learn, that you're going to start coming out of your box. So the two things that will get you out of your box are going to be the discernment and listening piece and the experimenting. And those two together are going to propel you forward through the wilderness, like we described, through some confusion. And as you continue to listen and reflect and experiment and reflect, new ideas and new revelations from God will come to you. Eventually, over a long period of time, those, well, maybe not long, after a period of time, you will be presented with a new and creative choice. That's when the whole process starts over again. And in that new creative choice, this is coming from God, and this is something that you wouldn't have accepted back when this whole process started. It would have seemed strange and unlikely, and why would I do that? But now, after this process, you're ready to say, oh, yeah, that makes total sense. Let's do that. And then the cycle starts again. So I want you to take a minute and go back to the workbook that you have. I'm going to bring it up here on the screen. And here we're on page 6. I want you to talk a little about how you as a congregation are going to engage in these different steps. How are you going to do the listening? Who's going to be doing it, and how are you going to go about doing it? Again, take some time and look at different ways to do it. But do the same thing for each stage. Now, it might be that you listen to God and then reflect on what you heard, and then you listen to each other and reflect on what you heard. This is going to take some time. It might even take a year to get through all these different listenings. But as you're listening, by the way, they don't have to go exactly in this order. You may listen to God and have some ideas and do an experiment. In fact, the listening to God might be an experiment for your congregation, doing it a different way. Same with listening to each other, the neighborhood. Those might each be experiments. But I want you to think about who is doing these things, in what order, and then how are you going to go about doing them, including the reflecting time. Once you've done something, who's going to sit down and say, how'd that go? What did we learn from it? What boxes did we confront in it? So go ahead, have that group conversation, think about how you're going to do it, and then come back to the next video.